Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I break that up. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Jacob Vidrine from Church of the Firstborn. We're going to talk about another LeBaron group led by Fred Collier. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
So what really kind of makes Ross significant to, in a sense, to connected to Mormon history in a degree, is that Ross kind of drew several historian followers in the 1970s. And one of them would be Fred Collier, who was, and these aren't like professional historians, but like people who were interested in history and kind of self-trained historians, I guess. So Fred became kind of a self-trained historian, and there were several other followers like Robert Black or Knut Knutson, who had a real interest in studying the early history and collecting information about the early history and information about temple ordinances. And they were really drawn to Ross because they felt that there was something really solid to his claims. And they kind of, the way Brian Hales described it on one of his older websites was that they exchanged and shared historical information with Ross that they had gathered, and Ross would teach them, about his, patriarchal priesthood and shared his higher teachings with them, kind of thing, where there was, it was very much knowledge based. I mean, like trying to, seek out, further light and knowledge, higher knowledge of the gospel. And I think Verlin, in his book, The LeBaron Story, in his brief 2 pages, he talks about Ross. He said that Ross, quote, likes to delve into the mysteries, is what he said. And so he was very big on preaching like the Adam God doctrine. And Ross, and with Ross LeBaronites, they kind of, took doctrine a bit deeper than what even you'd say fundamentalists go with a lot of doctrine, where, fundamentalists are big on are big on plural marriage. Ross and his followers kind of took plural marriage for granted, and they were more focused on understanding priesthood and what was taught in the early days about priesthood. With the Adam God doctrine, Ross and Fred and them would take the Adam God doctrine for granted as being taught by early prophets in the church, but they took it further in that they're like, how can we show the Adam God doctrine is in the scriptures? And so Fred at one time even published he wrote kind of a long paper. I don't think it ever got officially printed, but called The Adam God Doctrine in the Bible, where he makes a pretty interesting, somewhat creative case for the Adam God doctrine being in the New Testament in different places and also in the Old Testament.
And this is unpublished, you say, but it's kind of like a pamphlet that circles in.
I mean, he's kind of, some of his papers have touched on it. I would say like he did New Light on the ancient Hebrew early Christian doctrine on deity, which he presented at Sunstone, I believe, in the mid-1980s, where he shared a lot of this kind of research trying to argue for the Adam God doctrine from ancient religion and biblical study. And I think it's one of the best Adam God papers that's ever been written. It's my bias on that paper. I actually think it was a really good paper. Fred said that he even did a follow-up paper the next year called The Demise of the Hebrew Goddess, kind of arguing that, that Israelites used to worship Heavenly Mother, is what some of the scholarship shows, but that it was lost later on to Israel. And what Fred's unique take on it was that Fred believed that it was the sin of Israel with the golden calf wasn't actually the golden calf itself, but a big sexual orgy that Israel was engaged in at the same time. And they were involving themselves with the fertility cult, ritual prostitution, basically. That was, scholars believe it was pretty common among ancient religions. And so from doing that kind of caused God to say no more recognition of Heavenly Mother because you would blaspheme her name by doing that in her name. And so Fred was a really creative researcher, and he did unpublished revelations, was a big collection of one of the first big compilations that was, I think it was respected in a lot of historical circles, because when fundamentalists tried to publish certain unpublished polygamy revelations, they would always throw it in the context of the fundamentalist folklore that's surrounding, their beliefs. Like, it's not the 1886 revelation in of itself, but also the 1886 story, that Lauren Woolley told in connection to it. And so unpublished revelations really stuck to being very historical. And so I think that it was widely recognized as a pretty scholarly book with few problems in it by people at the time. And, it was valuable, not just, and it wasn't with a fundamentalist bent to it. I would say is kind of one of the benefits, was just laying out unpublished revelations and in a way that would be beneficial to scholars, to mainstream Latter-day Saints, and to fundamentalists alike. And so that's kind of where Fred gets kind of his fame, is through unpublished revelations, but he's done a lot of other, books and writings. But yeah, Ross got a number of different followers over the years. Like, it was never a big group, but there was always kind of a core group of, I don't know the exact number, a handful of patriarchs that were affiliated with him. And one of the big things that when Fred came into the work, the Church of the Firstborn, was, he was ordained a patriarch, and immediately was like, I want to start studying and trying to find research to kind of do missionary work, to, use research to support doing missionary work. And he discovered the principle of the law of adoption by reading John D. Lee's, the publication of John D. Lee's diaries, where John D. Lee records a bunch of law of adoption stuff in his diaries. And so Fred discovered that, and he got a strong testimony of adoption, and he takes it to Ross, and he shows Ross this Brigham Young sermon on February 16th, 1847 about adoption. And Ross loves it and gets, really believes in it also. And so from then on, the law of adoption became a very core aspect of how they structured the Church of the Firstborn, where anyone coming in to get patriarchal priesthood needed to enter into adoption covenants and be kind of connected in adoption to have a solid link into, as kind of the structure of how it was organized, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so Fred at that time made adoption covenants with Ross. He said he was the first one to make formal adoption covenants with Ross. And so that became a major emphasis in the LeBaron line. Now, I would say that LeBarons are probably the first fundamentalists to practice adoption since the church did away with it in the 1894. And so that was kind of one of the unique things about their beliefs, and that's something that Verlin kind of even mentioned in his book in 1981, was that he said that Ross says his patriarchal work is a first come, first get kind, I'm paraphrasing it, sort of thing, where he said, if you convert them, then you would have them be adopted to you if they wanted to be adopted to you, sort of practice of how missionary work was done. And there's statements in the 1840s where Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball talked about adoption in kind of a similar way.
All right, so let's go with Tom Green. Now, was Tom was originally with the Peterson group, which we haven't talked about yet. Was he with Peterson before he went to Fred Collier, or was it vice versa?
So, well, I understand. So Tom is like Fred, where he was in the church and he got converted to fundamentalism, and he initially, I understand, joined the Peterson group.
No, that's what I thought. And we haven't talked about Peterson, although I've had the Petersons on several times, but they're sort of a break-off of AUB in about 1978.
We kind of spent a little bit talking about all the old council break-offs, but the new council definitely has its share of break-offs. For first the Petersons in the 1970s, and the Thompsons in the 1990s, and then there's been other splits since the 90s. Talk about the Thompsons. Yeah, I mean, you did that interview with Moroni that I thought was pretty good.
But we didn't touch on the Thompsons enough.
Okay, that's fair. You didn't do the hours and hours that we've gotten into with the LeBarons. So, what really kind of so with Tom, he was initially in the Peterson group, and not only was he in it from the initially, but he was in it at a very early time, and he was actually one of, from what Tom told me, he was actually an apostle in the Peterson group,
Right.
and appointed to be a historian for their group. And so his story of going from the Petersons to the LeBarons, so kind of going from Woolleyite to LeBaron, is basically that he was kind of encouraged, I believe, by Gerald Peterson to collect information to kind of support their history, to support their priesthood beliefs. And so one of the names that came up for who he should interact with was Fred Collier, that he should go get in touch with Fred Collier and see if Fred can help him with, fundamentalist related history.
Because Fred had a reputation as being a historian.
Yeah, and Fred had been interacting with the 1970s were considered like a Camelot period for church history, right? Where the Leonard Arrington had really opened up the archives. And Fred really took advantage of that when he could. During that time period where he got a lot of unpublished Brigham Young speeches out, and he was able to use those for certain books that he wanted to publish, and a lot of diaries and other important, different, church history things that kind of would lean to like areas that fundamentalists would care about, like Adam God and different things that are related to that, and so. Fred definitely, I think, had developed a reputation for being kind of a kind of independent historian that was a fundamentalist, and so other fundamentalists kind of respected him for publishing unpublished revelations and for his historical work. And so the Petersons Gerald had suggested to Tom, get in touch with Fred and see what he can help you with. And so Fred started talking with Tom. And Fred had this idea. He said, let's do some debates on authority with Max Anderson, who's the church's kind of lead apologist at that time for defending the church against fundamentalists. And so he said, Tom, if we can organize these debates with Max, can you try to bring some of your people, and we'll have some of our people, and we'll have Max and whoever he wants to invite present for these, kind of cottage meeting debates going on. And so Fred organized this, and Max agreed to participate. And he said that Max kind of just spent he let Max kind of have the first round of, probably 3 or 4 meetings is what I understand, where he let Max kind of lay out his arguments against fundamentalism. And Tom kind of thought that was kind of genius of Fred in a way, where he said, instead of Fred trying to tear down what I believed in fundamentalist priesthood authority, that, not quite having issues with the historical record, he let Max do the work there and have Max be the one to kind of, be the anti-fundamentalist there. Like, Fred didn't like being an anti-fundamentalist. And when he would write on fundamentalist history, he generally would want to focus on the things that fundamentalists would like him to talk about, like things about the Lauren Woolley story that are supportable historically, rather than focusing on the parts that Fred doesn't think are historical, like the claims that men were ordained by John Taylor. So Fred kind of said that, the fundamentalists were actually kind of unhappy about this first couple of meetings where Max was just pummeling the fundamentalist position. And Fred had to tell him, he's like, be patient. When I get up, then I will be able to lay it all out and really kind of, rebuttal all of his arguments. Because Fred said, when he first became a fundamentalist in 1970, he watched a debate where Max Anderson was debating a fundamentalist about priesthood, and he really just kind of tore him up in the debate. Like, Max definitely had done a lot more research, and he had the church archives. He had been given special access to the church archives to have things to bolster his research in combating fundamentalism. I wonder if Marty Peterson might have been involved with
big and persecuting fundamentalists.
Yeah, he might have been happy to help him get whatever research he needed to combat fundamentalists. But, so Fred saw a debate between Max Anderson and a Woolleyite fundamentalist, where Max really kind of, knew his stuff really well in that debate. And so from that, like, Fred was able to kind of, see what Max's argument styles were. And then he also saw Max actually did a debate with Ross LeBaron in, I believe, 1970 or 1971. And he said that Ross, they were kind of talking past each other because Max was used to discussing woollyism, and Ross has got this totally different claim of authority that Max is like, not sure what to do with this. And what Fred said is that Max acknowledged to Ross, I did learn a few things from you in our discussions, but Ross wasn't a historian to have history to support what he was arguing. He just used like teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith and the D&C to argue his things. And so what Fred learned the issues in the 1970, and Fred said he spent, the next decade really digging into church history and finding a lot of stuff to kind of support the fundamentalist positions. And so after Max had his several meetings of getting to argue against fundamentalism, Fred got up and got to have his turn. And he said he just was able to lay it all out with source after source. It just kind of flowed out of him like a river, where he just had all the sources memorized and was able to share it in a way that Max really couldn't rebuttal the sources that Fred was quoting in that debate. And he said that after that meeting where Fred got one turn to talk after Max had several turns, that Max didn't want to come back to any future debates after that. And so Fred felt that he did pretty well and in those in that debate with Max Anderson. And he did well enough, at least, that Tom Green told me that was what converted him from the Petersons to becoming a follower of Ross LeBaron, and that Fred's history had really kind of helped convert him to Ross's claims.
And Tom Green was an apostle with the Peterson group at the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Tom became a pretty staunch follower of Ross as well. And so you have two different kind of claims of...
So both Tom Green and Fred Collier are followers of Ross LeBaron?
Yep.
Okay.
And Fred would kind of say that it was a lot of the people that came in, if not most of the people that were converted to Ross's claims, weren't really from his radio ministry of just kind of, being entertaining on the radio, but from Fred gathering a lot of historical research and then sharing it with people, that was really what converted quite a number of people into accepting Ross's priesthood claims.
So they were better missionaries than Ross was.
In some ways, the history can help. I think. Obviously, I think that the Holy Ghost is the most important teacher for missionary work, but it doesn't help to have some study and some knowledge to kind of deal with whatever pressing concerns the people you're teaching with will have when you're teaching. And so, Fred became a prolific author. He started a magazine in the 1970s called Doctrine of the Priesthood, where he just published little pamphlets. He that kind of had like unpublished Adam God speeches, other different things articulating kind of this theological framework they have. And so and lots of people, there are people in the church, there are people in fundamentalism from different groups who appreciate Fred's historical work. Even if they don't accept Ross's priesthood claims because they have their group they believe in, they still really appreciate, there being some kind of decent historical scholarship to kind of like show quotes. And Fred was definitely not a professionally trained historian, and Quinn has had criticized, some of the loose ways that Fred would interpret sources. But generally speaking, he knew enough about historical methodology to use solid sources, and would be able to point out when fundamentalists were not using solid sources. Like there was a quote that has been circulated in fundamentalism that said that in the Journal of Charles Walker that he wrote in the time in the 1800s that one of the early church members said that they recalled Joseph Smith said that Brigham Young would one day lead the church and would reveal the identity of God to the world. And so fundamentalists like that because revealing the identity of God to the world, they see as, oh, that's a prophecy about the Adam God doctrine. But Fred said with that quote that doesn't, when you've got something that fantastic of a claim, like, you got to go back and check the original source. And it turns out that was a spurious quote, and that the original just said that he would be one of the greatest missionaries to teach redemption to the world, is what Joseph said, and that he would one day lead the church. And so a little bit less fantastic than what fundamentalists would articulate. And so Fred was a big missionary for Ross's teachings until Fred felt about 1983 that Fred received a vision, like he had a vision of heaven that he felt was a very doctrinally significant vision, where he said that this vision kind of showed him what he called the principle of celestial family union, where he said that he was shown this family structure of heaven, which they already understood through law of adoption being emphasized in their teachings. But what this vision conveyed was that there was great union and commitment between everyone in this structure. And Fred called that principle total commitment, was kind of what he said, where it's like this, the thing that makes heaven heaven is the love and the union between everyone there. And so Fred had this vision that he felt was a very doctrinally significant core thing to the Church of the Firstborn. And he had found other things historically and kind of shared it with Ross at different times. And he wanted to kind of, like adoption, for example, being the thing that he discovered, and then he shared it with Ross, and Ross accepted it. And so he wanted to share this principle with Ross, and he felt that one of the problems with the way that things were under Ross was it was very loose, that everyone was, you get ordained and you go do your own thing for your own family, and there wasn't like a lot of organization or structure or tight union, if that makes sense. Everyone was kind of he said Ross was very much an individualist in his attitude, and he didn't really like being like in charge of other people, was kind of, and some people really like that. And Fred felt that, if you're being a religious leader, you kind of have to have some sort of responsibility to, help lead the people that are your followers, is kind of what Fred kind of felt things needed to be more that direction. So Fred said that he tried to share this experience, he said that core to it was this principle of, that the core celestial thing is celestial love, which Fred would say is not seeking individual aggrandizement, but being willing to selflessly help other people. And Fred said he had a vision before he met Ross kind of about the 3 degrees of glory that had convinced him that the fundamental distinction between the 3 degrees of glory wasn't what sins you did or didn't commit, or what, doing a checklist of what you did in your life. But this vision kind of, because it kind of answered a doctrinal question. If everyone has to accept the atonement and repent, or have to pay the price for their own sins, according to D&C 19, then why do people still go to different degrees of glory? Why doesn't everyone just go to the celestial kingdom? And what this vision kind of, he experienced articulated, and he received this in 1969, was that the fundamental difference between the 3 degrees of glory was the fundamental difference in what motivates people, like what the core essence of what your motivation is. And so from this experience, he believed that the telestial people are motivated by fear and fear of punishment to do the right thing. Like they need a policeman or a ruler to kind of keep them from doing bad things. And so that's kind of the lowest degree. And with the middle degree, terrestrial people are, according to section 76, the honorable and just of the world, but are blinded by the craftiness of men. So you're honorable and just, but he said that there's a distinction between that and a celestial person. So what is the distinction between someone's honorable and just and somebody who is celestial? And so he said this vision articulated that the terrestrial people are honorable, but they are seeking their own advancement, their own reward, basically. They are doing the right thing. They don't need a policeman to do the right thing because they're honorable, but they're wanting to get something out of the deal, if that makes sense. And so they're seeking their own reward and aggrandizement. And the distinction between that and a celestial person in Fred's vision was that a celestial person's highest motivation is losing themselves in caring about other people, that selfless love for others, and that Christ had and that we should strive to have. And I'm explaining this because Fred said that he needed to, that this was foundational to this celestial union, because you can have union in a bad way where people are taken advantage of. Like, there's a lot of priestcraft in fundamentalism where, there's a lot of good people in fundamentalism, but there's also been a lot of sad stories like Erbil, like Warren Jeffs, of people who will take their followers' commitment and just totally abuse their followers, right? And so Fred said that fundamental to this was this concept of selfless love and losing yourself in the service of others like Christ. And so Fred said he needed to convince Ross. He said Ross never really understood it that way, because Ross kind of had an attitude that he felt that you are working towards something. He kind of had that kind of mentality. And so, but Fred felt that he needed to convert him to celestial love. And so he took him out to dinner to try to convince him of celestial love, and as a prerequisite to this celestial family union principle. And he said that he wasn't able to convince him. And the more he tried to argue with him, the more Ross became belligerent in his view of, that everyone's kind of Ross had an idea that competition was a big driving force of the universe, that people are in competition. And I understand that with an economic system or sports, but there's a healthy competition. But I think that celestial love is probably a more important principle to the fundamentals of the universe. But he took him out and he wasn't able to convince him. So Fred was depressed that he was not able to convince Ross. And he said that Ross got so vehement, that Ross dug in his heels so bad in this debate, that he said that Ross unfortunately went so far as to say that Christ died for his own glory, to be, for his own exaltation, basically. And Fred felt that was blaspheming the atonement in a way. I'm not sure if that's just Fred's perspective on it, but that was what Fred went away from the conversation feeling very depressed about it. And he said that shortly after that Ross started to really change his priesthood teachings. But less than a month later, Ross totally changed his priesthood teachings to claim that actually, the LeBaron priesthood didn't actually come, the highest authority they had didn't come from Joseph Smith, but Benjamin F. Johnson got it from God the Father in the Nauvoo temple, and it was passed down. And there's a lot of different nuances and different things to this new priesthood cosmology, but essentially, he turned against his former priesthood teachings in some ways, and had a very different model of priesthood after that. And so that's when Fred ultimately decided to separate from Ross and basically continue to teach Church of the Firstborn. And, he basically ended up starting his own group and having his own, he basically said that he talked about succession with Ross in 1981. And he asked Ross, he said, you need to have a successor, because if you die without a successor, it'll be confusion, just like when your father died. And Ross basically said, if I appoint a successor while I'm still alive and doing things, then everyone's going to be focused on them instead of me. And so Ross says, I won't do it unless God directs me to. But, if there's anyone who's likely to be my successor, it's probably going to be you, because you've done more to build up our system and the work than anyone else. And so Fred said that Ross told him, I have not left you holding the bag. You can go ahead as the Lord has inspired you. And so Fred felt that was very similar to what Ross was told by Dare of, you can go ahead as the Lord inspires you to carry on the work. And so Fred felt that Ross's teachings kind of fell in doctrinal apostasy after 1983. And he said Ross still had some good things, but that there was a lot of error mixed in. And so Fred basically had his own split after that, if that makes sense. That he started, and he didn't really formally start it until the early 90s. And that probably peaked in the early 90s, where in 1992, Fred had, several hundred followers at one point. And he was trying to get a gathering going. And I heard that ultimately there wasn't enough practical concerns for how the gathering should work, like telling everyone to move out to rural Utah where there wasn't jobs, wasn't a long-term solution. A lot of people, when money ran out, then people became, disaffected and went back to their own lives. Is kind of what happened. So Fred kind of admitted that his mind was never really fully in temporal organization. He was never really good at that, but that he loved teaching the gospel, and that he's, writing about church history and the gospel. And that was kind of his big life mission in a way, so that he felt that he was called to do. And he's there's some controversy with Fred. He's a controversial guy.
Just one second.
Yeah.
So are you saying he moved from Davis County area to remote Utah somewhere?
So I think that most of the followers of Ross lived around Salt Lake County area. I think Fred's lived in many different places, but he ultimately, I think, went out to rural Duchesne County, I think is.
Fred did or Ross did?
Fred did.
Fred did.
Ross stayed mostly in Salt Lake to the rest of his life. So Tom Green, so that's kind of Fred's group, kind of in a nutshell. He's had various families get connected to him and, claim trace their authority back to him.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jacob Vidrine from Church of the Firstborn. In our next conversation, we'll talk about a very influential and controversial polygamist, Tom Green.
And then Tom Green, after Ross's death, tried to start a group where he tried to get Ross's followers to kind of unite under him. And that only lasted for kind of a couple years before, he went to prison, and then the group kind of fell apart after that.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt, so check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.